Before we start this podcast, I want to definitely remind you of a sponsor for Fresh of the Word, 20 by 20 Apparel. Founded in 2015, 20 by 20 Apparel brings original tributes to pro wrestling's classic arenas, moments, and events. They look to spotlight the bloopers, bleeps, and body slams along with the biggest, smallest, strangest, and strongest. In the world of wrestling where there's hundreds of shirts, promotions, flyers, social media accounts, and ads, don't get lost in the sea of parody shirts and display fonts. They can provide professional graphic design services at a reasonable price. 20 by 20 also hand screen prints all the tees in-house. So if you'd like to discuss a possible run of tees, posters, koozies, foam fingers, or even Zubaz, then drop them a line at 20by20apparel.com. That's the number 20x, the number 20apparel.com. And also check out their enamel pin line. It's super cool.
Fresh is the word.
I'm Jim Duggan, got long wood for plenty hoes. I keep it fresher than fresh, but you already know. You suckers bummy, I'm money, I got a ton of flows. My weed loud like a motherfucking thunder roll. Your shit quiet like you ballin' on a budget though. We see your kicks and we laugh and yellin' what it goes. You see me shining like a suit on puffy. You know my grindin' shit is too strong, buddy. That's why the dude call money. I be stuntin' like it's nothing at all. Cause it's nothing to me, it's probably something to y'all. Trying to smoke like me, then come and fuck with your dog. Got a closet full of kicks, you can't cop it tomorrow. And I'm fresher than the freshest, you can tell it's in my essence. Bitch, you see the way I'm rapping, yes I do this shit to death. I tell I'm running out of breath, I tell somebody cut a check. But either way you know it's fresh, and either way you know it's fresh. Fresh, we fresh. Fresh, 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 goddammit, we fresh. Fresh, fresh, goddammit, we so damn fresh.
Hey, welcome to the Fresh is the Word podcast. I'm your host, Kelly K. Fresh Frazier, and this is episode 178. Our guest for this episode is Joe Zanetti, who is making his feature film directorial debut with the movie KILLBIRD. Zanetti has produced and directed a number of critically acclaimed short films, including The Chase and The Slumber Party, and has a number of feature films in development. Zanetti has also worked in the video games industry with companies such as Scopely, Capcom, Ubisoft, and Warner Brothers, including the Warner Brothers hit Batman Arkham Origins and Star Trek Fleet Command. And with his directorial debut, KILLBIRD, it's a conspiracy theory that's a bit of a political twist to it that'll have you question who are the good guys and who are the enemy, and how much privacy do we really have, and what lengths our government will go to keep their status quo. KILLBIRD tackles very timely subjects as such without kid gloves. And during our chat, we talked about creating thought-provoking questions in the movie, the research in writing KILLBIRD, staying away from cliche characters, how this movie differs from conspiracy movies of the past, his creative upbringing, his creative process, and his experience in the gaming industry. So without further ado, let's get on to this interview with Joe Zanetti. Just to get things started, I think one of the, without giving any spoilers, one of the underlying themes that I saw with this movie is the idea of who's the good guys, who's the bad guys, what's the truth, and what do you do with the truth? When thinking about those things, what comes to mind? What were you trying to say with this movie?
Gotcha. It was definitely a film where I was trying to first experiment with expectations for the viewer, because when you first are introduced to the subject matter, you're given sort of a stereotype of, oh, this is this paranoid terrorist in the woods, and then you have this innocent woman who's a birder, who's like a suburban wife, and it's completely clean. And I really wanted people, when they were watching the movie, to have their expectations sort of thrown on their head, so to speak, so that everything they thought was true was wrong. And I think it's generally something we see, that we're very quick to make judgment and go to certain places when we perceive certain things that fall into very specific boxes. So I really wanted to play with that, especially with our culture today, where with communications and things, people make snap judgments so quickly. So that was definitely an area I really wanted to explore as far as sort of the initial areas where we had Riyadh and what our initial experience was with him versus where we went with him, as well as with Taylor, and what our initial perception was and how that developed over time.
What sort of research did you do to sort of make things realistic?
That I went down a lot of rabbit holes on that one, to say the least. It's I mean, once you start going down, it's really interesting what you find, because the writer I optioned the initial draft from had all kinds of, I would say, old school conspiracies that he incorporated into it. I then looked into what started happening in the early aughts as far as post-Patriot Act, and and started digging through a lot of the Edward Snowden files, actually, to see what kinds of NSA programs there were. So I feel like now, just for my Google searches alone, I'm probably on a watch list or something. But basically, I started looking at all these things, and a lot of the initial items that Riyadh talks about in the film are true programs that existed. So things like Prism, Fascia, X-Keyscore, Sentry Eagle, these were all programs that were looking at texts, looking at emails, looking at phones, that became something that didn't require due process during our initial times after 9/11, when terrorism was the only thing on all our brains. And so that enabled a lot of these programs to move in motion. And then with that, I basically extrapolated to a even more dire worst case scenario of where fear is actually something that's being encouraged, so that even more dire programs can be put in place.
How did you organize all the stuff that you found during this rabbit hole? Did your walls look crazy like his walls?
Did I have a conspiracy wall? Yeah, did I have a conspiracy wall on my wall? I mean, I would say it was actually a really interesting exercise, because I had my sort of bullet point list of here's my conspiracy, and then as I started having research nuggets of here's a real life thing, here's where I'm fictionalizing, it was a very interesting thing where I sort of layered truth and fiction upon each other as I was breaking down the script. And it was definitely something too where I have to keep a lot of things until the very back end of the film.
Yeah.
Because if you reveal it too early, then it basically destroys the entire pacing. So it was also, what am I revealing when? So I had to create a timeline for myself, as well as what the actual motivations were for each player, and then what the agency interplay was happening, and then what the actual conspiracy was, and where I was basing it off truth. So a lot of it was really complicated index cards that were put on board. So there was a little bit of a conspiracy wall to it, actually.
When you're sort of diving into this source material, what kind of effect did it have on your own psyche?
Got it. It's a really interesting question, because it is something that always, I think it's a really interesting thing about America, in that we have wonderful ideals, and sometimes in certain time frames when things get critical or there's crisis, sometimes we move closer to compromising our core values. And it was something where it was interesting to see sort of dark paths that we then start to avoid again. And it interests me, because I always care about the ideal, and I always like bringing light on things that, as citizens, we should be paying attention to and don't always. And it really comes to being educated and looking at, what's actually under the short, snappy comment that came out of, let's say, X senator's mouth or Y representative's mouth, and looking to what's actually underneath. What's the actual law? What's the actual documentation of it? And basically that was my main takeaway, was don't take things at face value, learn for yourself, know what's true, and then make your judgment. If some talking head is saying it, that doesn't necessarily mean that's what you should believe. And, I think we should all have that kind of diligence in our head to some extent.
When you were making this film, what did you do to stay away from any of these characters being cliche?
That one, that's always, this one was, I work with a great production partner. His name's William Carn. He's at Earth Orbit Productions. And then I have a nice circle of people who are sort of obsessed thriller confidants. So I have my own sort of cliche meter in my head where I'm trying to, every time I see something that's, okay, I've seen that in, however many thriller films, I'm going to try not to do that. But I also make sure I have passes from sort of my critical group. So if something is failing the cliche target, they always call it on me, or if there's a line of dialogue. So it's really nice to have a circle that you trust. And so I went back and forth with the script often with those guys. Also, I would say, which was one of the wonderful things, is my actors were extremely collaborative on set, and every time they had a line that just they couldn't make themselves do, we had a back and forth, and we were doing a lot of sort of adjustments on site to make it as natural as possible. So we were doing interesting rewrites on set to make things as organic as they could be.
When it comes to Taylor's character, this is the woman in this film. How did you go about not, making this a strong character where you're not, diving into any sort of cliches with her character, or not making it, from a misogynistic standpoint?
This one, whether it was the right approach or the wrong approach, Riyadh was a fairly foreign voice to me that I worked harder on. But with Taylor, I actually made her closer to the voice of myself. So I always was trying to create something where, is this something that and as far as the empowered woman that I was trying to create, I was having a lot of women read as well, but she's actually closer to my personal sort of dialogue train than Riyadh was. And so that was my initial take on it, was give her the sardonic sort of take that I would take to this situation and make it as naturalistic as possible, and then have my crew look at it and basically call me on anything that they thought was just extremely problematic. So it really does help to have those feedback loops. But I also, it was something where I'm going to go with the snarkiest version of myself and then put that into this woman's character, and that was sort of my initial take on how that came to be.
Oh yeah, her snark was pretty good. How do you feel like this movie would differ than a movie of the same type from a different generation? If this was made in the 90s or the 80s or the 70s, how do you feel like this would differ, and how do you feel like it would be the same?
Let's see, I would say the main differences are really in, I believe that a lot of the movies that were, especially in sort of the 80s, early 90s, I think you see a more binary version of good and evil, and you also see a greater level of loyalty to our institutions. And so I think probably you'd have more of a hero ending of saving the day against, it was a bad apple that we sort of resolved. Whereas I think given the climate we're in today, there's a lot more of a continuum of where the gray is, when does good turn to evil, and also what aspects of our institutions are problematic, and delving in more. So a movie that had the ending here, I think, would be, you'd see it probably a little less in old school. I mean, I think the areas where I was trying to use more tried and true things that we've seen in the past are as far as I would say setups and reveals, general sort of thriller conventions of say less early and don't do massive exposition dumps, sort of best practices for thriller writing, and making sure that the viewer is never ahead of the film. and that they always have something that is a complete unknown to them. One of my two of my main inspirations. One is Aaron Sorkin, because he's great at sort of not saying the obvious thing. And then David Fincher, who also is very good at that. But basically looking at those guys and trying to use their best practices as I put the film in the works.
You've touched on this already, but, just in general, even, for somebody listening to this, whether they're making movies or doing any sort of art, how important is it to have a trustful team around you to give you feedback about what's good, what's bad, what's problematic?
Got it. I personally am a big believer in it. I mean, some people have the sort of auteur conceit, but especially with low budget filmmaking, this was a massive collaboration. I mean, if I didn't have my production partner who I trusted, have a cinematographer I really trusted, have this team, I mean, the production design is part of the character of the cabin. So all these people brought so many elements to it. So I create the skeleton, and then having them add on the layers, I feel like is where you get from the 80% quality to much closer to sort of like 95 or 98 or wherever you want that end goal to be, because there's always people who are going to bring a layer that was not in your head and helps you. I mean, especially if you source and hire the correct people. I mean, that's why that's so important, is making sure you have the right team and that you have that trust built, because that was, I think, one of my main takeaways here was with this particular project, where it was 12 days, and on certain days we were shooting 10 pages a day. You have to have that trust so that you can move fast and make decisions quickly. So for me, totally critical.
After, doing all the research that you've done for this movie and then making the movie, what, in your opinion, are the things that just a regular American should be doing at this time to, watch out for themselves, to see what's going on in our country? And how can the regular American contribute to society?
Gotcha. It's definitely a tough thing, because we're overwhelmed by so much content right now. And I think the main thing is your typical American should be looking at not items like 24-hour news networks, not Facebook postings that have been shared 7 million times that are within the bubble of their friends. I think it's something where, one, when you're going to make a decision on something, at least find one contrary perspective, because also, just because you don't agree with something doesn't mean they're either dumb or crazy or whatever it is. Like, look at the opposing perspective, because I certainly have members of my family who have different political points of view than I do. And when you are reading sort of the contrary point of view, and then you're reading sort of the policy, it's really a matter of do your due diligence. Also, don't take talking points at their face value. And just because a lot of people are saying something doesn't mean it's true. It means what's your actual feeling on it, and how is it affecting you as a person? And then I always am like, vote, research people you're voting for, know what they actually care about, know what money is going into their campaign. I mean, you find out so much of that information is available now, so you can make really informed decisions if you choose to. I think it's really about choose to take a little bit of extra time, especially for the issues you care about. And so that would be mine. But it's a tough climate, because there's so much contrary information right now. And I would just say pick your items that are really important to you, and then make sure that what your feeling is on it is actually using all the data at your disposal.
Going back just into your life, when did you first sort of get the bug that you wanted to get into filmmaking?
That one's been sort of simmering for a while. Right after university, I was doing theater in New York for a bit, and then basically decided I was going to do a jump to LA. and then started mainly doing acting work. And I certainly realized soon enough that when you're acting, even though there's wonderful skills behind it, you're never actually responsible for the theme of the content. What are you actually saying? What do you want to say? What kind of art are you actually giving to people? And so that's not under your control necessarily. And so that's when I started sort of swiveling into in film production and looking at sort of greenlighting packages, working in script development and those kinds of areas. And once I started delving in there, it became very clear to me that I really wanted to look at the actual process of directing and do a project from soup to nuts. And I lived in Canada for a number of years, and while I was working in video game production up there, I also started having opportunities to do little short films and get these experiences on film. And as I continued to do it, it became clear to me that this was a great passion of mine, and that it was also very addictive, because directing is a super fun thing when you actually have everything in place. Getting to the point where you're ready to film is really tough, and post can also be very tough. But and I do love working with actors. Like from the training I had, it's something where I think I do understand their point of view very much, and I always like to really try to bring the best out in them when I'm working with them. And so I find that process really fun and as I say before, super addictive, because it getting these people together and putting together a scene that actually is tight and compelling and you really love, and after you're seeing it, it's a wonderful feeling.
What did you learn throughout your journey going through experiences in theater and wanting to be an actor, doing video games, and then going into filmmaking? Was there anything that you learned during that process that sort of translated through all of that?
That was probably my favorite thing, is all of it translates, because the acting work made me have a good eye for when things were not naturalistic, when a moment I wasn't buying it, when something wasn't correctly motivated. So the acting really helps me direct that, and also to create organic and realistic dialogue. The script development work was great at looking at some of the best scripts I've seen, and then learning best practices of here's a good scene versus a bad scene, here's a good structure versus a more problematic structure. And then with video games, what was great with that is it gave me great practices from a production point of view, so that I could put together a film on a really low budget and with an aggressive timeline, and still get a level of quality while cutting all kinds of corners to get the project done. So that was probably one of my favorite things, is that every single element that all that knowledge you accumulate, you're using all of it.
What's sort of your method of operation in regards to working with the actors that you work with to get the best out of them?
Gotcha. It really, first, rehearsal is super important. So I don't shoot anything without doing a baseline rehearsal of almost all the scenes. And it's not like we need to get the scenes perfect. It's more laying out what's the spirit of the scene, what's the status for both actors, and then coming up with a baseline blocking so that we know where the camera is going to be. We know generally what kind of escalation we're going to have, and even having an idea with them of what is the composition, the music escalation that we're going to see as well. So that we try and lay out prior to any shooting. And then once we're sort of on the day, then it's really about creating either as relaxed an atmosphere, depending on the content of the scene, or putting them in a really crazy space so that they can put them sort of off their game and on their game at the same point, so that there's an uncomfortability that gives them a bit more of a improvisational or organic feel to it. And the other thing that I learned a lot on this movie, actually, was having you really do need to take the time of going through numerous takes to finally find the correct moments. I wasn't doing, along the lines of David O. Russell, 25 takes or 30 takes or however many, but I did find that the nuance generally came towards the end when they'd gone through it a few times and were really comfortable. And once that comfort set in with the actors, that's when you really got some interesting little moments that they hadn't been finding before.
When you know you're going to be working with a limited budget, how does that go into just the preparation, the writing of making the movie, and then actually being on set and making the movie?
I would say it does impact the script pretty significantly, because with this particular one, I knew I was going to direct it when I started working on the script rewrites. And so while we were looking at action sequence and those kinds of things, it was always with the caveat in our head of, let's make sure this doesn't actually break us while we were doing it. So in some ways, it's creatively great because it puts you in this box of, okay, I have to find a solution to this particular problem, but I can't leave this room, or I need to be within this context and this environment. And so that creates an interesting box for you where you're not going to send them to the moon. You're going to create this sort of intricate layered element that has to work within this context. So that's one great thing about it. As far as while you're on set, the main thing is you have to be conscious of when you missed something on the day, because whereas a bigger budget project is like, oh, we'll do pickups, we don't have as much flexibility for those kinds of elements. So whenever there was something missed, we have a production meeting at the end of day where it's like, how are we going to grab a moment that either approximates this? So it was always, you have a little bit of producer brain in you while you're doing your directing, because you know that you have the limited time frame to get everything you need, and you have to keep planning out those days. And every time you miss, that's going on your contingency for the end of the run, and you only have so many hours at that end. And I will say our end day, we went through so many sequences because of need, based on little moments we missed over the course of the 2 weeks of shooting. So it was something where it became like we get this or die on so many different scenes.
Is there ever a time when you're shooting something and then towards the end you're like, okay, this is going good, maybe we can fit in this thing that we had planned on a few days from now into it right now and it'll actually work? Do you ever get a chance to do that?
Oh, I'm very happy that we did get a chance to do that. We had certain scenes we thought were going to be extremely problematic that we rocked out super fast. And then we have sort of our backlog of scenes of, okay, we missed this on this day, let's jump in there. Oh, the lighting is just right for this scene, let's jump in there. And we did that a lot, actually. And we also had moments of the opposite where a scene was like just lost where it was going to be. And at the end of it, we're like, we basically moved on, and we're going to need to come back to the scene. We know we didn't get it, and we have to find a time later. And so whenever we have those great moments where we are super efficient and rock it, it's great to be able to be like, oh, let's get in this insert that we thought we were going to miss.
When you have those scenes where you realize, okay, it just ain't going to work today, we got to do it another day, what do you do before you shoot it next?
Let's see. Well, this one, it was one of the moments where I probably let it go too long. We had a scene that was going long, and then we had a really important scene, which was Taylor and Riyadh in the office talking about Catalyst, and required some of the special effects. And so that one was end of day. There was a lot of pressure in that we had to time out all the SFX with a very specific timeline. And so it was something where I could tell our actors were definitely tense, nervous, and the lines were like sort of losing themselves. And so that was one where I kept trying it a few times, and it soon became clear that this one was just not going to happen. And so even though we got most of it, we cut it off early and did some final sort of easier sequences. and knew we were going to have to go back to it. But it's a really tough one because you have the schedule in your brain, and you're always like, oh, we have to get this today or die, and sometimes that just doesn't happen, and you have to just sort of pivot your entire schedule really quickly.
What do you hope the audience that watches KILLBIRD gets out of watching it?
Let's see. A few things. I think it's about what is your first impression of something? What is something actually? And two, I think it's like people changing minds, changing their point of view, because you have, and as I say, without revealing spoilers, you have a situation at the end of the film where there was a certain scenario, and then you have a pivot where you have a reversal, and Taylor is left in a very different space than she was much earlier in the film. So I think it's something where the ability to see change, the ability to look at sort of the continuum of what is good and what is evil in our world, and just our general perception of what's out there and how as individuals we're looking at it. What is the importance of an individual's response to something like, are you propagating what other people are saying, or are you taking the time to change that conversation?
To anybody listening to this interview, doesn't matter what avenue of artistry that they're in, what's sort of a nugget of knowledge from your life or career that anybody listening to this could sort of project into their own life?
I would say the big one, and this is a little cliche, but it's something where if you are really passionate about something, other people will see that passion, and you can build a village around it, and that thing can happen. Generally, it's tough if you're an individual alone, but if you have enough passion for a project or any work of art, usually the content that you're submitting will show that passion there, and then that will start creating a community around it. Because this project I was specifically passionate about, and I think it started to resonate with a group, and then that group expanded and expanded again. And that, especially when you're on low budgets and things, it's about the community you create, and just continuing to sort of like move forward with whatever that passion is. That's what I would say.
Right. Going forward, what do you have on the horizon? Is there anything else that you can talk about that you'll be working on?
Sure. I do have a lot of other thrillers on the horizon. Probably the most immediate one is I'm tag teaming with my other production partner on a supernatural thriller called Relapse, which is basically upping the game from this project and going into sort of a bit more of visual effects territory, and it investigates sort of what is truth in that you've got a mentally ill man who is on drugs, and what he's seeing, he's not clear whether it's real. And then the other project I have on the horizon is a revenge thriller called Lex Talionis, which is really about our justice system and when our justice system fails us, and what we can do as individuals, sometimes to a bad negative place, to try and get justice in those situations. And that looks at almost a very 12 Angry Men kind of scenario, but with more life and death on the line, depending on basically a crisis that happens. I know that's a little vague, but it's I don't want to reveal too much at this stage. Right.
What did you do in the gaming industry, and how did that influence your filmmaking?
I have been first I was a narrative director who was working on small projects for Ubisoft. Then I became a producer working with Warner Brothers on projects like Batman Arkham Origins, working with the Dead Rising franchise for Capcom. And the great thing that it allowed me to do was, one, I was working with great video game writers who were inspiring, and also I had to deal with a lot of video game cinematics, motion capture, and that is a really interesting process where you meet a lot of interesting actors, and And two of them, actually, I met when I was working at Capcom, who are in KILLBIRD. I met both Alicia while I was dealing with Capcom mocap, as well as Aaron Douglas. And so it's something where it's a world that's not too far from film anymore, because a lot of video games are hitting that level of fidelity.
Right.
So there's an interesting back and forth between them, and even whether it's the talent, whether it's the cinematic directors, the actors, you find they all kind of live in the same community. So it almost doubled down on what I was doing in film, in that I could basically go back and forth and leverage different elements from both industries.
And I always like to end my interviews with the same question, and I gave it to you ahead of time to think about. Who is somebody that you would suggest that I have on this podcast that would have some great stories or some lessons to talk about?
Got it. I was thinking about that, and there's a guy I worked with when I was in LA prior to moving to Canada, who was very inspiring to me. His name is Ron West, and he was an actor on Third Rock from the Sun for a long time, and then he did a lot of work with Second City, just sort of setting the stage for what good improv is. But I did a number of plays with him when I was back here, and he basically was one of the inspirations I had as far as create your own stuff, in that he wrote this wonderful musical called The People versus Friar Lawrence, that was sort of this sardonic parody of Romeo and Juliet, and which had a great run at the UBCP Theater Upright Citizens Brigade Theater. And after seeing that and seeing that come to fruition, and also he's a super funny guy. He's been in the industry forever, and so I think he'd be one that would be an interesting guy for you to tap.
All right, thank you. Before we get out of here, where can people go online to get more information about what you're doing and more information about KILLBIRD?
Certainly. So it's Facebook, KILLBIRD Movie. It's also Instagram, KILLBIRD Movie. And frozenfishproductions.com is the website for my company. And we'll be providing more information soon as far as distribution, new festivals that are coming out. It's all in motion right now, and I hope to have updates in the next couple months.
All right, so that was my interview with Joe Zanetti. For more information about KILLBIRD, you can go to the show notes for this episode at freshasthepodcast.com. And before we get out of here, I definitely want to remind you how you can support the podcast. I'm on Patreon now, so you can go to patreon.com/freshastheword. And for as little as a $1 a month, you can support Fresh as the Word. And for the $3 a month tier, you have access to our Patreon-only episodes where I go deep into my audio archive for interviews that I've done outside of Fresh as the Word for the past 10 years or so. A lot of stuff that I just used a little bit for an article, some I didn't even use at all. So there's a lot of exclusive content. It's all music stuff though. And I got some good stuff up already. I'm going to try to do about 5 episodes a month for the Patreon-only subscribers. And remember, Fresh as the Word does stream pretty much anywhere podcasts are streamed. So please rate and review anywhere that you can, especially Apple Podcasts. That'll help out the show a lot. And if you want to follow Fresh as the Word online, you can go to Twitter at Fresh is the Word, and that's is with IZ. Instagram at Fresh as the Word Podcast. And you can join the Fresh as the Word Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/freshastheword. It's a really cool group. And you can follow me online on Twitter and Instagram at kfreshastheword. Or you can email me at djkfresh@gmail.com if you have any comments, thoughts, pitches, anything you want to send to me. That'd be great. All right, that's another episode in the books. Thank you for listening. And like always, go out there and live life with intensity with a capital 10. Goodbye and good night.
Fresh is the word.